All right, I think it's time. Yeah, it's past time. So just a couple of things, a couple of bookkeeping things. I sent you all an email about Zoom breakout rooms. The reason that we are unable to set up breakout rooms beforehand is that in order to do this, you have to have a Zoom account. You can sign up for a Zoom account on Zoom's website, sign up for the free account. And once everyone is signed up for that, then we have a set of pre-assigned breakout rooms that will actually function. So I sent you a link that sends you to, I think it's a Business Insider website that shows you the steps to go through on setting up your Zoom account. And that will help Dr. Judd and I because we won't have to spend time at the beginning of class setting up those breakout rooms. On Monday, we're going to be talking about the introduction that you're writing for the literature summary that is due October 12th. And we're going to do a lot of that discussion in small groups. So if you could get that done by Monday, that would be really helpful to us. So that's that situation. Did somebody have a question? No, I thought I heard a voice. Okay, so then the other thing is, we're working you slowly through this process of writing a literature summary rather than having you write it, you know, getting ready for October 12th and put it off until October 12th. We found that it's easier to break it up into smaller chunks as you get ready to write this first writing assignment in this class. So I guess it was on Wednesday or yesterday, maybe it was, that I went through and I added a number of things to this general section at the very top of the Bio 133 Moodle site. The literature summary grading rubric has been up there for a while now. It's been up there since the beginning of class, actually. But then there are some guidelines. So this is a PDF document. My advice is read through that. It basically describes what we're looking for in the assignment. And hopefully those things are also reflected in the literature summary grading rubric as well. And then I've also, I did this a number of years ago. Since you've already been exposed to the Coote case study, I basically went and reread the paper that that case study is based on. And what I did was I sat down and wrote what I think is an exemplary sort of literature summary. So you can see here, can you see it on the page? On your screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. So you can see that it's 2 pages long. There's a little bit of space. There's like 1 line left over at the bottom. You can see that my name is in a header. And basically, it's a 4-paragraph structure in this case. An introductory paragraph, a paragraph on methods basically, and then a paragraph on results and discussion, and then a paragraph on critical thought. And so this was written by me having read the paper, having taught the case study a number of years, and I just sat down at my computer and wrote from my memory of the paper a literature summary. And so this is essentially what you should be looking to accomplish. I've also put on the Moodle site the original Lion article. So if you click on this folder, you will see 2 things in the folder. You will see both my literature summary. I've named it the way I want you to name your literature summary, and you can see the original article. And then the last thing that I put up here is we've graded a bunch of Henry et al. Literature summaries over the years. And so I also, a number of years ago, prepared some like general feedback that applies to practically every semester that we've done this. Students tend to make the same mistakes on their first literature summary. So I was reading through this yesterday, and there's actually a lot of good information in this as well. And if you read this before you start writing your literature summary, you're going to avoid some of the pitfalls that people who've come through the class before you have fallen into. So a ton of resources on how to succeed with literature summaries. So please avail yourselves of those resources, and you'll do a better job on your literature summaries than if you didn't take advantage of those. Questions about that? Okay, so by the beginning of class on Monday, you need to have saved your draft as a PDF and uploaded it to this assignment that is on September 14th. This is a preparation homework assignment, so it's not worth a lot of points, but the point here is to get you started on a draft of your literature summary before October, so that you do your best work once again on that first literature summary. All right. We were talking about the Galapagos Islands last time, and we were talking about niches, I believe, was where we finished up. So let's do this. Can everybody see the niche slide? All right, this is where we finished up, right? If I'm recalling? Okay, so we were talking about the niche being this hypervolume of requirements that species need in order to survive and reproduce. And the example here is a three-dimensional niche that is temperature, humidity, and pH. But anything that is either a resource that an organism uses or a set of physical conditions that an organism needs to be in order to survive, all of those things could be niche dimensions. And like I said before, Evelyn Hutchinson, who was this ecologist at Yale back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, he put forth this idea that the niche is this hypervolume, this multidimensional space in which organisms survive best. And in the process of adapting to the physical environment and the biological environment that you find yourself in, we find that organisms evolve physiological characteristics and morphological characteristics that then allow them to survive in a particular niche. And so we talked about variation in the carapaces of tortoises, and I think we were about here when we ended. And so I've taken a map and I've adapted it so that you can see that on individual islands there are species that are known from individual islands. So Pinta has Abingdoni, which is one of the species of tortoises. Santiago has Darwini, et cetera, et cetera. In some cases, these have been extinct. For example, Lonesome George, which you have maybe heard about, is from Pinta Island, and that was thought to be an extinct island population, except that they found some individuals that were evidently from Pinta who were transported to Isabella, probably by sailors back in the 1800s, and so they're repopulating Pinta. As it turns out, February of 2019, the species Fantastica, which was on the island of Fernandina, was rediscovered by a group of researchers, I think once again from Yale University, strangely enough. And so each island has its own species of tortoise. In some cases, the Big Island has two species of tortoise. And when we look at, once again, these islands, we see that these islands vary a lot in terms of their three-dimensional profile, their elevational profile. And so, for example, on the island of Isabella, there is one tortoise that is found on Sierra Negra, Alcedo, and Darwin volcanoes, and then there's another species that is found on Volcan Wolf. There's another species, once again, that has just been recently rediscovered on the island of Fernandina. And so I just basically took this map and I then essentially mapped onto this map images of each of the different species. So this is Vicina, this is Fantastica, this is taken from a museum specimen because it was thought to be extinct. This is Beckai, Abingdoni. And so you can see how shell morphology varies according to island. And these guys are obviously all going to be feeding on cactus because that's a common characteristic of the saddleback tortoises. So there's this idea that you become adapted to a particular environment, and natural selection shapes, in this case, your morphology to survive well in that environment. Same thing happens with shells. These rounded shells that have big apertures here are more prone to desiccation. Narrower shells with narrower apertures are less prone to desiccation. We once again see that these things vary by island, and so you see that on the island of Santiago, you see all of the species on the island of Santiago here tend to be these long, narrow species, and we see that Santiago is not one of the tallest islands. It's got some elevation to it, but it has a lot of surface area of the island that is relatively low elevation, which is going to be relatively dry. So this idea that evolution shapes organisms evolutionarily to fit their environment is a long-standing idea in biology. We've been talking about animals, but don't forget that plants also have adaptations that help them survive. In the case of plant species on these islands, many of the plant species that we see in the Galapagos Islands are, once again, drought-adapted species. Classic example of this is various species of cactus in the genus Opuntia. The things that we normally think of as the big green parts are actually stems in the vocabulary of talking about plant structure, and the spines are actually modified leaves. And so what they've done is they've undergone a case of extreme leaf reduction as a method of conserving water over evolutionary time. Mangroves grow along the coast. They have seed dispersal mechanisms that have evolved such that the seeds float through the water. And then this is, of course, those Scalesia trees that I had mentioned last time that tend to occur in the moister parts of the Galapagos, where you have more moisture, you have more opportunity for plants to grow to larger size and for them to not be quite so drought adapted as they are in the drier parts of the Galapagos. So the same kinds of adaptations that we see in animals, we also see similar sorts of adaptations in plants. These adaptations for conserving water, etc. So that's kind of an introduction to the Galapagos as a whole. But on these islands, each island, as we've seen with the tortoises and with the snails, each island has its own suite of species. And the islands differ somewhat in terms of how many species occur on the island. So what kind of factors might influence the number of species that you find on any given island?
The amount of land.
Okay, so the total area, so the amount of land, and what specifically would be the relationship there?
How habitable that land is.
Oh, so, but you were talking about the size.
Yeah.
So as size goes up, what would you expect the number of species to do?
Oh, be more diverse.
Yeah, so bigger islands should have more species. What other things? Somebody else. What else might influence? And Nathan, are you keeping track of who's participating?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What else might influence the number of species on an island?
The amount of food resources, whether it's like other plants or other animals.
Okay, so the diversity of other kinds of organisms, but of course the diversity of other kinds of organisms is also going to be correlated with the size of the island as well. So what other things?
If they have predators or not, it could influence if they are like the population size.
Okay, so predator presence or not might influence the number of species on an island. What else?
The landscape of the individual islands.
Okay, who is that?
Joseph.
Oh, Joseph. So what do you mean by the landscape?
Like if it's an older island, if it's like doesn't have as high of mountains and peaks and stuff.
So when we think about this figure here, this figure might have an important aspect of it. So Isabella and Fernandina are about the same size as Marchena or Santa Cruz, but they have more elevational structure. So actually the total surface area of that island is actually bigger because there's this elevational variation. What else?
Access to fresh water determine the type of species that are on each island.
Sure, so having access to fresh water, once again, that is going to be related to elevation as well. So you see how a lot of these things are correlated with one another. Where are the Galapagos Islands?
I was just about to say the climate.
Okay, so climate, that's related to water also. Once again, also related to elevation.
I think the sea current.
Okay, so sea currents can bring organisms to an island or keep them away from an island, depending on the nature of those sea currents. The ocean current that goes to the Galapagos goes right along the coast of South America. So you might expect the species that occur in the Galapagos to have come from South America rather than from Australia, for example. How far away are the Galapagos Islands from South America?
Was it like 500 miles or?
I think it's more like 650 or something like that.
Okay, yes.
Nathan, do you recall?
I don't offhand, but I can pull
Anyway,
it.
it's a long way away, especially if you're just floating across the ocean as a turtle coming from South America. How might the number of species be different if those islands were located 40 miles off the coast of South America?
There would probably be a greater number of species because it wouldn't like take as long, so they wouldn't need as many resources along the way.
Yeah, who's that?
Key.
Okay. I should change this to some other mode. Yeah, if you're closer to the mainland, you have less ocean to go across, and as a result, more individuals are going to be more successful at making it there, and so that might increase the number of species that are on an island. So as it turns out, a lot of these things are important. So this is an introductory paragraph from a paper from Helmus et al. 2014 that for me is one of the most elegant distillations of island biogeographic theory I've read. You can read entire books about the theory of island biogeography, and I'm actually looking for one of those books on my shelf, but I don't seem to find it. But this is a really good distillation because it distills it down to the fundamental factors that influence the number of species, and it has to do with island size and distance from the mainland, and also this definition includes what we call in situ speciation that happens on the island itself. And so just take some time to read this at some point, because I think it does a really good job of describing what island biogeographic theory says in a distilled form. Over time, people have recognized that as islands get bigger, they tend to have more species. This is a graph from Darwin 1958 that is the number of amphibian and reptile species on islands in the Caribbean, mainly the Greater Antilles and some of the Lesser Antilles. You could have done this for all of the islands in the Caribbean, and you would have come to a similar sort of looking graph. But essentially, as islands get bigger, you have more species. And MacArthur and Wilson, Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson came up with this idea in 1963, which basically relates two fundamental processes: the process of extinction and the process of immigration or colonization to species richness. So whenever you approach a graph, the first thing that you should do in a graph is look at what?
The X and Y axis.
The X and Y axis. And in this case, what is on the X axis?
Number of species.
Number of species. And so this is also referred to sometimes as species richness, the number of species. And in this case, this is not the greatest, it is labeled. So you should also see that it goes from 0 to some value P, which is the number of species in the source pool that is presumably providing species to this island or this archipelago. And then what's on the y-axis? Somebody else.
The rate.
Okay, rate. And rate of what?
Extinction or immigration.
Rate of either extinction or immigration. And so the rate would be slow or fast. So this is how rates work. And so the graph basically relates species richness to the rate of immigration and the rate of extinction. And this is a fundamental mistake that students often make is interpreting this figure correctly. If an island has no species, the rate at which species arrive at an island, new species arrive at an island, is going to be high. Why would that be the case?
There's nothing to compete with.
Okay, I think I heard somebody say it. There are basically no species there, and so any individual that arrives there, the chances are that species is going to be a new species, and so the rate of gain of those species is going to be relatively fast on islands that don't have many species. As an island continues to gain species, what happens to the rate of new immigrant species? It goes down. Why?
Because there's more competition, and then there's already some species there, so there's...
It's not competition, though. Set competition aside now. If you have an island and species 1 arrives, that's a new species, and then another individual arrives and it's in a different species, species 2, and a third individual arrives and it's in another species, species 3. With only 3 species, each new individual that arrives at the island is a new species. But when you get species 4 and species 5 and species 6 and species 7, the chances of another individual of species 2 arriving goes up simply because species 2 is already there. That doesn't increase the number of species on the island. That just increases the number of individuals on the island. And then if another individual of species 6 appears, once again, you don't have an increase in species richness because species 6 was already there. And so as you get more species on the island, the rate of new species coming in goes down, not because you have fewer individuals arriving at the island. It's just that the individuals that do arrive aren't new to the island. They're already members of that species that occur there, which is why this line goes down. What's the situation with extinction rate going up as you get more species? If you're the first species to arrive on an island, what do you have? All to yourself.
All the resources and everything.
You have all the resources all to yourself. And so the chances of you surviving are actually pretty good because you're not having to compete with anybody for resources. As more species show up, though, what happens to those resources?
The resources go down.
The resources that are available go down because you're now competing against other species. So extinction rate is low with few species and goes up with more species. And these two things vary by what characteristics of islands. What characteristic of an island will affect the immigration rate?
Distance from the mainland.
Distance from the mainland. So these curves might have different elevations on this graph depending on whether they're far away from the mainland or whether they're close to the mainland. What aspect of an island is going to affect extinction rate?
How many resources it has.
How many resources they have, and that's going to be affected by what aspect of the island.
How big it is?
How big it is, exactly. So these two things, island size, island area, and distance from the mainland are crucial. So, and I think I've actually talked over the next couple of slides.
If I can jump in while you're looking there, remember what that P stands for? That's the total number of species on the mainland in the source pool. So if you imagined, you can think about it the other way too. If you imagined a brand new island and you just loaded up with individuals from every species on all of the continent of South America, then it would be so overfilled that extinction rates would be really, really high, right? So you could move in the other direction, the same as if you had a new island and you're the first one to get there, you got the whole place to yourself.
So we can think of islands as being more isolated or less isolated, greater or lesser habitat diversity, lower and higher elevation, larger area or smaller area. These are the important factors. And I think I've actually gone through a lot of this already. Yeah, I've already walked you through this whole thing.
Yeah.
So these are just simple sorts of things where we can put points at each of these. It turns out these are not linear relationships, but for any given island where the immigration rate and the extinction rate intersect, that's where you should expect the number of species on an island to appear. And so this is referred to as the equilibrium number of species. And as it turns out, these curves are actually not linear, and that's why the original figure appeared the way it is. But when we talk about this equilibrium number of species, that's a number of species, but it doesn't say anything about the identity of the species. So if a new species comes in, what the equilibrium number says is that that species that is newly arrived is either going to go extinct or it's going to succeed, but it can only succeed at the expense of another species that is already there going extinct. And so you'll see the number of species on the island bounce around this equilibrium, but be relatively close to the equilibrium. So that equilibrium is dynamic because species composition can change. And one of the things about this model is it simplifies a lot of variation among species because it doesn't really matter what species it is. The question is how many species are there? And the one thing that this model ignores is what? All this model includes are two
Evolution.
things, right? It excludes evolution. Yep, exactly. You looked at the next slide?
Nah.
No.
I don't have it.
Yeah, in the original paragraph that I had at the beginning of this little section, evolution is explicitly included in that. But MacArthur and Wilson's original model didn't include evolution as one of the factors that was involved in setting the equilibrium number of species on an island. So E.O. Wilson and MacArthur, Robert MacArthur published this idea, and then a guy named Dan Simberloff went to Wilson and said, hey, I've got this cool idea. We can test your idea by basically going to mangrove islands off the coast of Florida, putting a big plastic dome around them, and then gassing them with insecticides, killing all of the insects that are on the island, and then watch and see how these islands repopulate with the insect fauna. And so they chose islands that were far away from the coast of Florida and closer to the coast of Florida. They chose big islands and small islands, and they basically killed everything on them and then watched how they repopulated. And so these are the trajectories for different islands. These are the levels that they were before they got rid of everything. And you can see that over the course of 680 days, most of these islands have returned to be very close to their pre-defaunation levels, once again supporting the idea that any given island can support a certain number of species regardless of what the identity of those species are. And so this has been one of the ideas in ecology that has had a really long-term sort of staying power in terms of explaining this particular thing. So that's the theory of island biogeography. And I forgot that I was going to do this, and I didn't set this up before, but now I can do it. So we've done these kinds of quizzes in the past. And I should have pulled this up before class started, but I kind of forgot about it. So I'm going to log in to this site, Kahoot. This is kind of online quiz. We've done this in class before, and there's no reason why it shouldn't work now. So pull out your iPads, and you're going to need your iPads for this activity. Can you see my web browser?
Yeah.
Go away. I'm already an epic Kahooter. I don't need your help. Can you guys see the web browser?
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right. I was just on this a couple of days ago, and it did not make me go through all these steps. Ah, here we go. So we're going to play a little quiz. And you need to, when you log on to the Kahoot site, put in your actual name, because we're going to keep track of who wins. The winner of the Kahoot quiz will get 3 points for their team. The second place person will get 2 points. The third place person will get 1 point for your team in based on the results of this. So let's see. We'll do classic mode since you guys aren't together to operate. So oh yeah, the irritating music.
Yeah, mute that.
I'm going to turn that music way down. So once you get on Kahoot, www.kahoot.it, you can put your name in. We see the list is populating. 169152 is what you put in there. You guys are following along excellently. All right, is that everybody? It's hard for me to tell. Raise your hand if you're on. All right, let me switch screens. Okay, all right, cool. Looks like we have everybody on. Oh, there's Devin. Okay. All right, so here we go. There's going to be a series of questions. Just answer the questions as they come up. How were the Galapagos Islands formed? Do you have 24 people? Usually, oh, there it is. Okay, so almost all of you got that they were arose through volcanic activity, which is one of the first things that we talked about on Wednesday. So this is going to keep track of people. So let me just remind you that the way the game works, it balances speed and being right. And so the two of those things actually affects what one's score is. Just so you know kind of how the game works. Which of the following do not contribute to the climate of the Galapagos Islands? Do not contribute. Okay, so most of you said proximity of the islands to one another does not affect the climate. Obviously, latitude does, because the closer you are to the equator, the warmer you're going to be. And El Nino also influences the climate of the islands, because El Nino is this warming of the waters off the coast. That leads to more evaporation, and that more evaporation leads to more rainfall. And rainfall is one aspect of climate. All right, good. Going to refigure the scores, and off we go. Oceanic waters in the southern hemisphere circulate in what direction? Okay, so this might seem like an unnecessarily nitpicky sort of question, but why is the direction of ocean currents important?
Because the temperature depends a lot on the, where the ocean current is coming from.
Okay, so the ocean current is actually a counterclockwise current, which means that it's coming from Antarctica, running up the west coast of South America, so that when it gets to the Galapagos Islands, you find that the Galapagos Islands are situated for a large portion of the year in this cold water current coming up from Antarctica. So counterclockwise was the important thing. If it was clockwise, you would have seen the ocean current traveling along the equator and then turning south to go down the west coast of South America. And so you would see that the Galapagos are in a warm water climate, a warm ocean current all year. So that's why it's important. So it's a nitpicky sort of detail, but the detail has broader implications for this big thing that is important, like climate. All right. Good job. Let's keep going. So this deals with island biogeography. Okay, so near islands that are also large. And some of you said near small islands and far large islands. So why does a near island have more species than others, than a far island?
Species don't have to travel as far from the mainland.
Okay, and why do large islands have more species than small islands?
More resources.
More resources. So that combination should then have the highest species richness of all of the island types. Okay, Sydney is on top and seems like she wants to stay there, but she's getting some competition. Which of the following is an adaptation to dry conditions you might expect a plant to exhibit? We didn't actually tell you all of these things. Okay, so small leaves. Your other choices were large leaves, reduced root systems, and leaves close to the ground. What's the problem with having large leaves?
They would need more water.
They would need more water because leaves have stomata and they warm up more, they have more stomata, and as a result, that greater leaf area allows more water to be lost through the leaves. Why would having reduced root systems not help you in dry conditions?
Because you got to reach deep to get the water.
Okay, so if water is at a premium, you want to have extensive root systems to reach that water. Why would it be bad to have leaves close to the ground?
Herbivorous animals could feed on those leaves.
Okay, but does that have much to do with dry conditions?
Oh, no.
No, it doesn't. It has to do with interspecies interactions. If you're in a hot environment, what's happening to the ground?
Heat rises from the ground.
Okay, so the ground is heating up. It heats up the air right next to the ground. So one of the ways to avoid water loss from leaves is to actually have your leaves further away from the ground. And if you go back and look at the plant adaptations, in the figure of the opuntia, one of the things that you'll see in that figure of the opuntia, and I should have pointed this out to you, my bad for not doing this, is the opuntia, the cacti in the Galapagos. Oftentimes they grow up a central trunk and then they blossom, they kind of have a tree-like structure to them. And so they won't have very many stems down at the lower part of the plant, but they'll have them up higher, which is also, of course, why the tortoises have this modified shell to reach those upper Nopales. Why do I know the name for it in Spanish, but I don't know in English? The stems. What are they called in English?
The common name is the paddles.
Paddles. The paddles. In Spanish, they're called nopales.
Mm-hmm.
And people eat them. You can make soup out of them and things like this. What's
And
that, Nathan?
The term that people want is a cladode, a leaf-like stem.
Yeah. All right. Galapagos finch species are most famous for differing in what? This should be an easy one for everybody. Yeah, it's all about the beak morphology, and we're going to be covering this a lot more as we go. And I haven't talked about this, but this was talked about in the video. And actually, their coloration is really pretty standard across the different species. And last question. Which of the following does contribute to rainfall variation in the Galapagos? And you should get this one based on our last discussion of a similar question. El Nino, once again, latitude is the same for all of the islands, so they shouldn't really vary all that much. So proximity to the island shouldn't have an effect. The Humboldt current doesn't lead to variation. So this is another tricky part. This is variation in rainfall. Normally the islands are pretty dry. What leads to year variation is the movement of this warm water across the ocean. What's another correct answer that we could have put in this question? So El Nino isn't the only thing that leads to variation in rainfall.
Isn't it like the elevation of the islands?
Yeah, so I could have put elevation here, and that also would have been a correct answer, because variation on a given island varies from the bottom of the island near the ocean to the top of the island if it's one of the mountainous islands. All right, cool. So let's see who won. So Riley was third. Elena was second. And Katie was first. Came from behind there at the end. All right, cool. So we'll record that on your whole participation grade thing. All right. One of the best ways to study for an exam is to create quizzes for yourself. So the information that we've been going through, if you want to know what you know, either have another member of the class make a quiz for you, or make a quiz for yourself and then come back tomorrow and take that quiz and see how much of the stuff that's on that quiz are you actually retaining from day to day. I made a gazillion quizzes for myself when I was an undergraduate. It's a really good way to study because you have to study the material to make the quiz, then you have to recall the material to take the quiz, and then the quiz reveals to you what you're retaining and what you're not retaining from the things you're being taught. So let's get rid of Kahoot because it's making irritating noise in my head. All right. Any questions about the introduction to the Galapagos? All right. You've already been introduced to natural selection by Dr. Judd in talking about the horn lizard selection study that was done that was in Science by Young et al. I want to give you a little bit of background about kind of how the theory was developed, how it came into being, a little bit of the story of Darwin and Wallace, who are the two people who kind of came up with this idea. A faculty member who used to teach here, who now teaches in North Carolina. I looked at her notes one year from her watching me lecture, and she wrote in her notes on one of these days, like, this is interactive story time with Paul. So this is what what this is, interactive story time with Paul. So, so the theory of evolution via natural selection was developed independently by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And I want you to know a little bit about these two people because.
All right, so Jasmine didn't tell my roommate what we are doing tonight, but then now my roommate.
You're on speaker.
You're on, Paula.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I just muted you. All right. Well, now you've unmuted yourself. All right. So these two people are very different, and so I want you to have a little bit about their backgrounds. So Darwin, well, let me see, what's on the next slide? So Darwin came from a relatively well-off family. His parents and grandparents were involved in medicine. They basically were expecting him to become a medical doctor, but he ended up not being able to stand the sight of blood. And so he then went and studied theology. And but the entire time that he was going through these phases of his education, he was always interested in the natural world. So he was always going and hanging out with people who worked in the museums at these institutions. And he was interested in beetles, and he was interested in birds. He was interested in snails. And he really didn't pay much attention to his other studies. He did just well enough to graduate, but his heart really wasn't in these other areas. And he ultimately ended up getting a degree in theology because his parents thought that would be a respectable way of taking this unfocused guy and have him have a respectable profession. And it would also, of course, leave him plenty of leisure time to do the things that he really loved, which is hike around and study nature. So as he was finishing college, his parents were kind of wondering what was going to become of him. And one of his professors put him in touch with the captain of a boat, the HMS Beagle, that was about to embark on this 5-year journey around the world. And Darwin went to get permission from his father to go on this voyage, and his father refused to give him permission. And at that point, it was his uncle who went and interceded with his father and said, hey, you should really let Charles go and do this. And that's how he ended up finally being on the boat. While he was on this journey, this is where he got his ideas about evolution. He read this book called Principles of Geology by a guy named Charles Lyell. And the view of the age of the Earth at this time in human history was that the Earth was very young. And the reason that people thought that the Earth was very young is because we didn't know anything about geology. Or we knew not nearly as much about geology as we know now. And it was based on a series of calculations that people had made of the number of generations that are recorded in the Bible. And they came up with an age of the Earth that was about 6,000 years old. So about 4,000 years before the present time. And as it turns out, that is very, an estimate of the age of the Earth that is very far off what we now think of as the age of the Earth. And what Lyell's book basically did was it made the argument that the Earth is very, very old. And his argument is an argument known as uniformitarianism, which makes it almost sound like a religion, like Catholicism or Protestantism, but it's not. Uniformitarianism is this idea that the same processes that we observe today are the same processes that have been observed, that have been in place for forever, essentially. In a sense, there's nothing new in terms of the physical laws that govern things. And so the geological processes of islands being formed by volcanism, canyons being formed by erosion, et cetera, these are all processes that we see now. But in order for you to get from a little bit of erosion every year to the Grand Canyon being developed requires a great deal of time. And so in order for this idea that the same processes that occur now are the same processes that have always been occurring to lead to things like the Himalayan mountains and the Grand Canyon, you need a great deal more time than 6,000 years. And so one of the influences on Darwin's thinking was the fact that Lyell had made the Earth a much older place than the Earth was thought to be before Lyell came along. So basically, Darwin collected his ass off when he was on the ship. He came back with lots of specimens, and he started thinking about the species problem, which is something that he was thinking about while he was on the boat. And he wrote up an abstract of his ideas. It was about 180 pages by 1844, and he gave this to some friends of his. One of his friends that he gave it to was actually Charles Lyell, and the people who read it said, these are some good ideas, but you need to gather more information, more data, and flesh them out more. And so he held on to this manuscript and continued to amass data, amass observations over time. And all the while that he was doing this, there was this other guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, who was younger. Oh, I'm getting ahead. So basically, the kinds of observations that he made were that species on islands were similar but different from those of the nearest continent. Dispersal got organisms to these islands, and then they changed after they got to these islands. He was interested in what process achieved this modification. He came to the conclusion that it must have taken a really long time because organisms don't generally change very often. And this was Lyell's contribution to his thinking. And this, of course, didn't jive with the static view of the world that was presented by religious people at the time. So Lyell's principles of geology was very, very important to this. So at the same time that Darwin was doing all of this thinking and amassing more information, this other guy named Alfred Russel Wallace was growing up. He was younger than Darwin. He had read the journals of Charles Darwin that were published after Darwin got back, and he wanted to go and do the similar kinds of things that Darwin did. And so he traveled to South America with a friend of his named Bates, and they collected a bunch of specimens. And then Wallace got all of the specimens on a ship and was coming back to England. He was planning on returning to England as a celebrated naturalist with all these specimens from South America. And his ship caught fire and went down in the ocean. He was out at sea in a small boat, I think for 20 days, when another ship came by and picked him up. And basically he lost most of the vast majority of all of the work that he had collected in South America. He got back to England. He wrote up a couple of papers based on his notes and observations from South America. And then rather than being totally discouraged, he then took off for the Malay Archipelago. And while he was in the Malay Archipelago, he was noticing the same kinds of things that Darwin had noticed. The relationship between the flora and fauna of islands and the continents that were nearby. The fact that species that lived in one area tended to all resemble one another in many fundamental ways. He had the benefit of Lyell's writings, but he also had the benefit of Darwin's writings as well. And the end result of this is that while Darwin was developing his idea of natural selection, Wallace was also developing his ideas about natural selection. And in 1858, he wrote to Darwin, sending Darwin a manuscript, asking him to read this paper, present this paper at a meeting of the Linnaean Society of London. And when Darwin opened up the package and read the manuscript, it was basically an abstract, a shortened version of this longer version of this idea that Darwin had been developing since 1836, essentially. And at that point, Darwin was in a pickle because he had basically just gotten scooped by Wallace. Well, what ended up happening is Darwin went to friends of his that he had already talked to, Robert Hooker, Charles Lyell, and said, I have a problem now because, not Robert Hooker, John Hooker rather, now that I'm looking at the people who read it. I have a problem now because I've had these ideas in the past, but this guy who's in Malaysia has just sent me this manuscript. What am I going to do? And so what they agreed to do is that John Hooker and Charles Lyell both read the papers of Darwin and Wallace at the same meeting of the proceedings of the Linnaean Society, and they got published in the proceedings in the Linnaean Society Journal in 1858. And so oftentimes you only hear about Darwin, but the idea of evolution via natural selection was arrived at by both of these people. And so this is the actual citation, and they appeared back to back in the proceedings of the Linnaean Society. So what did they say? Well, they basically had 4 preconditions set up. And these 4 preconditions are, for the most part, the first 5 chapters of The Origin of Species. They're not in the same order, but they're basically all there in the first 5 chapters. So I refer to these as the preconditions for evolution via natural selection. So the first of these is that more organisms are produced than can survive. And next week, Dr. Judd is going to be talking to you about population growth, but it's this idea that oftentimes populations tend to grow exponentially, and you can't have populations growing exponentially for forever. And so organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive. You can have populations that tend to level off at a carrying capacity, but the nature of that carrying capacity is that offspring are still being produced, but an environment can only carry so many individuals of a particular species, such that competition becomes involved that then allows some individuals to survive better than other individuals. So whether we're talking about exponential growth or what we call logistic growth, that still sets up what Darwin referred to as the struggle for existence. The struggle for existence is set up by this assumption that more organisms are produced than can survive. This is an idea that came from Malthus, who was a natural philosopher. Malthus wrote in 1799 a treatise on population growth that basically made the point that human populations were growing exponentially and that this was going to lead to famine and war and pestilence and all of these kinds of things. Second observation, their second precondition is that phenotypic variation exists. This is, I don't know why I'm doing everything from Yale University lately, but this is a group of undergraduate students from Yale University. The females are in white, the dark clothed individuals are males, but you can see that there's variation from very tall individuals to very short individuals, and there's a big lump of them in the middle. A certain amount of this variation is genetic. And so the third precondition is that this phenotypic variation is heritable. It's determined by genes. The size of your parents, if we're talking about height, so this is height, the size of your parents is going to be correlated with the size of offspring because the genes in your parents are found in offspring. And so tall parents tend to produce tall individuals, short parents tend to produce short individuals as offspring. So phenotypic variation is heritable. When you have more offspring than being produced than can survive, when they vary among the offspring and when that variability is heritable, what this means is that, oh, I've already talked about this. Oh, I need to talk about this. I'm off my game today. So variation is heritable. We usually measure variation by looking at this correlation. Not all traits are variable, but many traits are variable. Finger number is not variable in humans. So if we look at finger number, all parents have 5 fingers and all offspring have 5 fingers. The heritability here is a heritability of 0. But if we look at the depth of the beaks of Darwin's finches, we see that there's variation in the parent bill depth and there's variation in offspring bill depth. And this is 2 different time periods, 1976 and 1978. We'll talk about this time period in more detail. This basically represents a population that is pre a selective event and post-selection, and you can see that beak size is changing over time in this figure. And we also saw, and so the last precondition is that phenotypic variation is correlated with variation in fitness. And this is what we saw in the horn lizards. Horn lizards with large horns relative to their head survive better than individuals with small horns. And of course, one of the things that they didn't talk about in this particular paper, of all of these preconditions, phenotypic variation being correlated with variation in fitness, phenotypic variation being heritable, phenotypic variation existing, and population growth, which things did they not talk about in the horn lizard paper of these 4 preconditions?
If you're not sure, you can work it out. 2 of them are on the graph in front of you.
So these are the 4 preconditions. More offspring are produced than can survive. Inter-individual variation in phenotype exists. Inter-individual variation is heritable, and phenotypic variation leads to variation in survival or reproduction. This figure that you see in front of you, which one of these preconditions is this one speaking to? Actually, it's speaking to a couple of them. In this figure, what can we see?
The variation as well as the phenotype.
Okay, so we can see that variation exists because we have short-horned lizards and we have long-horned lizards. What else about variation can we see?
That it's correlated with fitness.
It's correlated with fitness. Okay, so what's not included then in the paper on horned lizards?
Overproduction of offspring.
Okay, so they make this assumption. They make this assumption simply because some of them are dead. So that's kind of like obvious. What's the other thing that they didn't do in this paper? In the horned lizard paper.
Variation in the heritability.
Yeah, they don't measure heritability at all. And one of the reasons is that it's hard to raise baby horned lizards. But the cool thing, here's the cool thing. Here's the actual very cool thing. At the Fort Worth Zoo, there is a horned lizard breeding program. And this past year, they just released their first cohort of Texas horned lizards. And so they actually presumably have data on the correlation between horned lynx in parents and the horned lynx in offspring. And so we could actually get this information now, which we couldn't before, simply because we've never had a captive breeding thing. So what the theory of evolution via natural selection says is, if this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, species will evolve via natural selection. If any one of those things breaks down, you won't have evolution occurring. Because if everybody who's born survives and reproduces, what do you not have happening in this set of preconditions?
variation with fitness.
Yeah, if everybody survives and reproduces, then there's no variation in fitness. So once again, there's no variation, there's no basis for selection. And so if any one of these things breaks down, you can't have evolution via natural selection. You might have evolution via some other mechanism, but not via natural selection. And that's a lightning fast run through an introduction to natural selection. The next, well, until October 12th, we're going to continue to be talking about evolution via natural selection. Starting next week on Wednesday, we're going to be going through each of these preconditions in detail. So we're going to spend a day on population growth. We're going to be spending a couple of days on variation, phenotypic variation, its genetic basis, the heritability of it, and finally talking about competition in this system, which is the basis of selection in Darwin's finches. Questions? All right.
So the literature summary is due by Monday, you said?
Yep, Monday at the beginning of class, it's going to be the basis of your discussions with one another. So get that done, get it submitted, and come to class ready to talk to one another about it. Nathan, do you have something?
Just going to say, don't forget to set up a Zoom account. We got an email about that so that we can do our small groups better on Monday.
Yep. All right. Enjoy your weekend. Read the Henry et al. Paper, and get writing if you haven't already started.
Okay.